I purchased an old suitcase at an auction for only $10, but when I opened it, I discovered a hidden compartment beneath a false bottom. Inside was an envelope and $2 million in cash. After reading the note tucked inside, I felt the air leave my lungs. Hello, everyone. This is Diana once again. I'm happy you're here with me today. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I've always been the type of person who sees value in things others throw away. And I don't mean that figuratively, I mean it quite literally. Every Saturday morning, while most people were still asleep or scrolling through their phones, I was already on the road with a thermos of coffee, heading to estate sales, flea markets, and auction houses throughout central Ohio. My name is Carol Merritt. I'm 43 years old, teach art at a middle school, and have been divorced for 6 years. I live in a small 2-bedroom house that my ex-husband used to call a warehouse for other people's junk. To me, it was simply home. Before that October Saturday, my life was pleasantly ordinary. I followed my routines, enjoyed my small comforts, appreciated my students' unexpected talents, and shared my home with my cat, Biscuit, whose behavior was always wonderfully predictable. I paid my bills, maintained a modest savings account, and convinced myself that what I had was enough. Most of the time, I truly believed that. The auction took place at Harrove and Sons, a medium-sized auction house in eastern Columbus known for handling estate liquidations. I'd attended many of their auctions before. Folding tables were lined with old lamps, chipped dishes, furniture, and boxes filled with paperbacks, pieces of lives that once belonged to strangers. I wasn't searching for anything specific that morning, which is often when the most interesting finds appear. Near the back wall sat a lone suitcase, separated slightly from the other items, almost as if nobody knew exactly where it belonged. It was an olive green hardshell Samsonite from the 1970s. The brass-colored latches had aged into a rusty orange shade, and the leather handle showed cracks but remained intact. A faded luggage tag hung from one side, though any identifying name had long disappeared. I examined it and immediately liked it. The winning bid was $10. The young clerk barely glanced up as he processed my payment. Looking back, that's probably the moment I should have paid more attention. As I carried the suitcase toward the exit, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He appeared to be in his 40s, heavy-set, wearing a canvas jacket despite the warm weather. He wasn't casually observing people around him. He was watching me specifically. The intensity of his stare sent a chill down my spine. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away. I convinced myself I was imagining things, loaded the suitcase into my trunk, and drove home through the quiet streets beneath a gray morning sky. Biscuit greeted me from the windowsill when I arrived. I poured another cup of coffee and placed the suitcase on my kitchen table. The latches opened surprisingly easily. Inside appeared to be nothing. The interior looked unusually clean for something that old. No dust, no old receipts, no traces of its previous owner, just smooth olive green lining. As I pressed down on the fabric, I felt something unusual. A ridge, a seam, something that shouldn't have been there. My heart hesitated. Using a butter knife from the kitchen, I carefully worked along the edge of the lining. After several minutes, the entire false bottom lifted out. Beneath it was a sealed manila envelope, and beneath that were stacks of cash held together by aging rubber bands. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. Standing there in my kitchen, wearing weekend socks while my cat watched from the counter, I stared at approximately $2 million in $100 bills. Then I opened the envelope. The note inside contained only 6 short sentences, written in the shaky but careful handwriting of an elderly person. If you found this, you've earned it. I spent 40 years earning it too. My son knows this money exists. He must never find it. He is not the person he pretends to be. God bless you, whoever you are. I read it 3 times. Then my legs gave out. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long while. Eventually, Biscuit walked over and rested his head against my knee, the closest thing to concern he'd ever shown. My coffee sat untouched and cold on the table above me. Eventually, the practical side of my personality took control. I closed the suitcase, carried it to my bedroom closet, and hid it behind a row of winter coats. Then I returned to the kitchen and did what any sensible person would do. I made a list, not a list of things I wanted to buy, a list of facts. What I knew, what I didn't know, and what those facts meant for my safety. I knew I had legally purchased a suitcase at a public auction. I knew it contained $2 million in cash and a handwritten note hidden beneath a false bottom. I knew the writer intentionally concealed the money and clearly wanted to keep it away from their son. What I didn't know was who originally owned the suitcase, whether the money was legitimate, whether the son knew the suitcase had been sold, or whether he knew who bought it. And then there was the man in the canvas jacket. The more I replayed the encounter, the more unsettling it became. Could he have been the son? The possibility sat heavily in my stomach. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't someone who ignored danger or believed rules didn't apply to her. But I also wasn't someone who panicked. Looking at my list, one thing became clear. The person who hid the money had done so intentionally. Whoever found it was meant to have it. And according to the note, the one person who wanted it most was exactly the person who shouldn't get it. That realization changed everything. I stopped being afraid and started being careful. My first step was gathering information. I needed to learn whose estate had been auctioned. Public probate records in Ohio would provide those answers. My second step was finding legal counsel immediately. Before touching a single dollar, I needed to know my rights. And the third step was preserving everything exactly as it was. I photographed every stack of cash, the note, the hidden compartment, the suitcase itself, and the auction receipt. I backed everything up securely. Then I began researching. The estate belonged to Dorothy Ellison, an 81-year-old woman from Gahanna, Ohio, who had passed away 8 weeks earlier. The executor of her estate was her son, Richard Ellison, age 47, Columbus, Ohio. When I searched his name online, I found something that made me shut my laptop and sit silently in my kitchen. 4 years earlier, Richard had been investigated in connection with financial elder abuse. The alleged victim, his own mother. At that moment, I realized Dorothy Ellison knew exactly who she was hiding from, and exactly why. The message read, "We need to talk. I'm outside your school." I froze. For several seconds, I stared at the screen. Then I immediately called Patricia's office using the school landline and left a message with her assistant. After that, I notified the school administration that I might be dealing with an unexpected visitor. The one thing I didn't want was a confrontation on school grounds. When I reached the front entrance, I saw him standing in the parking lot. Richard Ellison, mid-40s, heavy build, canvas jacket, the same man I had noticed at the auction. So he had been there that day, personally watching me leave with his mother's hidden secret. He wasn't alone. A woman stood a few feet behind him, perhaps in her late 30s. She had sharp features, folded arms, and the alert expression of someone who evaluated every situation before stepping into it. His wife. I would later learn her name was Diane. I remained at the top of the entrance steps instead of walking down to meet them. "Mr. Ellison," I said, "my attorney has already contacted you. Any further discussion should go through her." "I'm not here to discuss legal paperwork," he replied. The friendly tone from our phone call had vanished. "I'm giving you a chance to make the right choice before this turns into something neither of us wants." I repeated his words. Something neither of us wants? Like a court proceeding that examines how your mother's estate was handled? His jaw tightened instantly. Behind him, Diane shifted slightly. "You have no idea what you're involved in," Richard said. "That money isn't yours. It was hidden for reasons you don't understand, And those reasons didn't disappear when my mother died. There are people who expect that money to be returned. He paused. People who aren't known for being patient. The implication was obvious. He wanted me to believe the money was tied to dangerous individuals, people beyond him and beyond the family. Fear through uncertainty. A classic intimidation tactic. Fortunately, I had spent the previous night reading Patricia's notes on manipulation and pressure tactics. I pulled out my phone. "I'm going to count to 5, I said calmly. "If you're still here when I'm done, I'll call the police and report that the executor of Dorothy Ellison's estate is trespassing at a middle school and threatening a private citizen." 1. Diane immediately placed a hand on Richard's arm. "This isn't over," he said. 2. They turned and left. As soon as they were gone, I walked back inside, sat down in the hallway outside my classroom, and spent the next 10 minutes quietly trying to stop myself from shaking. One of my coworkers, Jenny Park, noticed me and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was dealing with a difficult family issue. Without asking questions, she brought me a cup of tea. It was exactly what I needed. That evening, I updated Patricia on every detail of the encounter. She filed an additional notice documenting the incident and, with my approval, discreetly contacted a former colleague at the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. She wasn't opening a case. She simply wanted Richard Ellison's name noted in connection with a civil matter involving his late mother's estate. "Think of it as placing a marker," Patricia explained. "Is that ethical?" I asked. "It's a conversation between attorneys," she replied. "I mentioned a name, nothing more." I trusted her judgment. Still, after the call ended, the exhaustion hit me hard. Not ordinary tiredness, the kind that comes from being constantly alert, always calculating risks, watching surroundings, and managing fear. The next morning, I arranged for substitutes at school and rented a small cabin about an hour east of Columbus near a state park. I told no one where I was going. For 2 days, I disconnected. I walked quiet trails beneath bare autumn trees, heated canned soup on a small burner, and finally finished a novel I had abandoned months earlier. I avoided legal emails. I didn't look at photos of the cash. For 48 hours, I allowed myself to simply exist as a normal person. By Sunday morning, I felt calmer. The blue pickup truck was gone when I returned home. The house looked untouched. Biscuit greeted me with his usual outrage over an insufficiently full food bowl, which felt strangely comforting. Whatever came next, I felt ready for it. The next development arrived on Tuesday. It came as a formal letter from attorney Gerald Swick of Swick and Bauer LLP, a polished law firm located downtown. The letter proposed a settlement. In exchange for returning the suitcase and everything inside it, I would receive $50,000. The payment was described as compensation for my inconvenience and presented as a good faith effort to resolve the matter. $50,000 for $2 million. Patricia called immediately after receiving it. "They think you're desperate," she said. "Most people would be tempted by $50,000. "They assume you won't stop to calculate what you're giving up," I replied. "Exactly," she said. "And because it's coming through lawyers, they're trying to make it appear legitimate. If you accept, they get the money back and obtain documentation proving you agreed voluntarily. And afterward, you would have very few options to challenge the settlement later." I had already decided not to accept. Still, hearing it laid out so clearly made me realize how carefully designed the offer was. It wasn't generosity, it was strategy. "Draft a rejection," I told her, short and direct. "I already have," she replied. After the call, I stood at my kitchen window looking into the backyard. Bare branches, leaves gathered against the fence, a cardinal perched at the feeder. And I thought about Dorothy Ellison, an 81-year-old woman who had spent decades building something, protecting it, hiding it from her own son, and leaving behind 6 trembling sentences for a stranger she would never meet. She had trusted that whoever found the suitcase would stand firm. I didn't know if I was that person, but I intended to try. The secrecy was becoming difficult. Patricia had advised me to tell almost no one, and legally, that was the right decision. Emotionally, it was exhausting. Keeping a secret this large creates a unique loneliness. The most important thing in your life becomes the one thing you can't talk about. Eventually, I asked myself who I truly trusted. Only one name came to mind. My sister, Renata. Renata lived in Cincinnati and worked as an emergency room nurse. She possessed an almost superhuman ability to handle chaos. After our mother died, she became the person I called whenever life became genuinely complicated. So, that Saturday, I drove to see her. I brought everything: the photographs, the note, the probate records, the legal correspondence, the settlement offer. For nearly 2 hours, I explained the entire story while she prepared dinner. When I finally finished, she looked at me quietly. "You've been carrying all of this alone for 3 weeks." "Yes." "And you've handled it exactly right." "I hope so." She picked up the photograph of Dorothy's note and read it again. Then she looked directly at me. "You are not giving that money back to a man who financially abused his 81-year-old mother." Her voice was firm. "That isn't legal advice. It's simply common sense." Something inside me loosened. A weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. We talked late into the night. As always, Renata asked question after question, examining every assumption and every decision. By the end of the evening, she had identified 2 issues I hadn't considered. Did Dorothy have any other surviving relatives? And had the elder abuse investigation truly been closed? Both questions mattered. On Monday, I relayed them to Patricia. She already had information regarding the investigation. It had been closed without charges, but the file still existed, and the investigator remained employed at the prosecutor's office. "Can we make sure they know this situation exists?" I asked carefully. Patricia paused. "Leave that to me." A week later, Richard and Diane appeared again, this time at my house. The doorbell rang at exactly 6:47 p.m. When I checked the peephole, I saw them standing on my porch holding a bottle of wine. A bottle of wine, as though they were neighbors making a friendly visit instead of people who had spent weeks pressuring me. I opened the door but stayed in the doorway. "Carol," Richard began, his voice once again polished and pleasant, "we owe you an apology." He held out the bottle. "We were grieving," he continued. "We handled this badly." Diane smiled politely. I stared at the wine and thought, who brings wine to someone they've threatened? People who have decided to try a different strategy. "I appreciate the gesture," I said, "but any discussion regarding the estate still goes through my attorney." "Of course," Diane replied smoothly. "We're not here to discuss legal matters. We simply want you to understand the bigger picture." There it was, the invitation, the suggestion that I lacked critical information, that I would make a different decision if only I knew the full story. "What bigger picture?" I asked. I still hadn't moved from the doorway. Richard briefly looked irritated before recovering. "Our mother wasn't mentally well toward the end of her life," he said. "She became paranoid. She hid things. She wrote notes that didn't accurately reflect reality." There it was. The attempt to discredit Dorothy, to portray her as confused and unreliable. "She sounds like someone who might have required a competency evaluation," I replied. "Did the estate attorneys arrange one before probate?" Diane's smile tightened. "We're not here to argue legal details," she said. "We're asking for compassion. There are grandchildren involved, family members who loved her. That money represents her life's work." A new angle, emotional leverage. I recognized it immediately. "I understand why it matters to you," I said, "but understanding your feelings doesn't change the legal facts." Richard's expression hardened. "You're making this much more difficult than necessary." Now the friendliness was completely gone. "There are things about that money you don't understand," he continued quietly. "Things that could make life very uncomfortable for you." "Is that another threat?" I asked. "I'd like to describe it accurately when I update my attorney." Diane immediately intervened, placing a hand on his arm. The gesture was familiar. She'd done this before, many times. "We're not threatening anyone," she said carefully. "We're simply encouraging you to reconsider." She left the wine bottle on the porch railing before they walked away. After they left, I photographed their car and documented everything. Then I sat alone and admitted the truth. I was afraid, genuinely afraid. But beneath that fear was something stronger. Anger. Dorothy Ellison had hidden $2 million because she feared her own son. Everything I had seen suggested her fear had been justified, and through a hidden compartment, a handwritten note, and a suitcase sold for $10, she had placed her trust in a stranger. I wasn't going to betray that trust. Later that night, Patricia informed me that the probate court had scheduled a hearing regarding the legitimacy of the estate's auction authorization. We finally had a date, December 14th, 3 weeks away. I finished grading papers, fed Biscuit, and went to bed. Sleep didn't come easily, but the next morning I got up and went to work. When one of my students asked why I looked tired, I smiled. "I'm working on a difficult project." "Is it hard?" the student asked. "Yes," I replied, "but I'm going to finish it." December 14th arrived under a gray Ohio sky, cold and colorless, like an old photograph brought to life. I chose my outfit carefully that morning, a navy blazer, tailored trousers, and low heels. Professional, controlled. The appearance of someone who had already decided exactly how the day would unfold. Patricia met me outside the courthouse at 8:30 a.m. She carried a leather portfolio so overstuffed it looked ready to burst, yet somehow she appeared as composed as ever. As we walked inside, she updated me. "They filed a counter motion," she said. "Their argument is that the suitcase was mistakenly included in the auction inventory and that the estate never intended to transfer its contents." "Can they prove that?" "They'll certainly try," she replied. The hearing took place in a modest probate courtroom before Magistrate Elaine Watkins. Across the room sat Richard and Diane Ellison with their attorney, Gerald Swick. Richard wore an expression of quiet disappointment, while Diane's face remained carefully unreadable. They looked prepared. What they weren't prepared for was Patricia. The first half hour was routine. Arguments were presented, questions were asked. Swick claimed the suitcase had been listed by accident and argued that Richard never knowingly approved the transfer of millions of dollars. Patricia listened patiently. Then it was her turn. She stood and dismantled their case in 3 deliberate steps. First, she introduced the signed auction authorization form. Richard Ellison's signature appeared clearly at the bottom. Every item on the inventory had been personally approved by him. The olive green Samsonite suitcase was listed as item 47. Signed, dated, witnessed. Swick objected, arguing that Richard had approved the item without knowing what was hidden inside. Patricia smiled politely and moved on. Second, she submitted Dorothy Ellison's medical records from the final years of her life. These records had been obtained legally and directly contradicted the narrative Richard and Diane had been pushing. There was no dementia diagnosis, no findings of cognitive decline, no indication that Dorothy lacked mental capacity. At the time she hid the money and wrote the note, she was fully competent. I noticed Richard's jaw tighten, only briefly, but I saw it. Then Patricia delivered the final piece, a certified copy of an amendment Dorothy had added to her will 8 months before her death. The amendment specifically instructed that all personal belongings be sold through public auction and that those sales become legally final once completed. The room fell silent. Dorothy hadn't merely hidden the money. She had carefully built legal protections around it. She had created a pathway that would make it nearly impossible for her son to reclaim the funds without contradicting his own actions and challenging documents she had filed while fully competent. Everything had been planned. Everything. Patricia addressed the court. Your Honor, my client legally purchased the item and everything contained within it. The transfer was authorized by the estate executor and aligns completely with the decedent's documented intentions. We request confirmation of ownership. Judge Watkins turned toward Swick. Counsel. Swick leaned toward Richard and whispered something. Richard immediately shook his head. Beside him, Diane pressed a hand against the table as though restraining herself from speaking. Finally, Swick stood. Your Honor, we request a continuance to review the newly submitted materials. Judge Watkins looked unimpressed. You have had 3 weeks since receiving notice of this matter. The evidence presented today directly responds to arguments your client introduced. She paused. Request denied. The courtroom became perfectly still. After reviewing the documents, she spoke. The court finds in favor of the petitioner. Ownership of the purchased suitcase and its contents is confirmed as belonging to Carol Merritt. The estate's claim is dismissed. Richard rose abruptly. This is Mr. Ellison. The judge's voice cut through the room. If you wish to discuss further legal options, speak with your attorney. You may not continue speaking in my courtroom. She gathered her papers. We are adjourned. As everyone stood, I noticed Richard's hand trembling. Not from fear, from frustration. The frustration of someone accustomed to getting his way and discovering in a public courtroom that this time he wouldn't. Diane placed a hand on his arm for the 3rd time, the same gesture she had used repeatedly. This time it failed. He pulled away sharply. For the first time, I saw the truth. This wasn't a partnership. It was a woman trying to manage a man she feared. I thought of Dorothy. Patricia and I walked into the hallway. She shook my hand with both of hers. For someone who rarely showed emotion, the gesture said everything. She was remarkably clever, I said quietly. Dorothy. Patricia nodded. She also had an excellent estate attorney. I glanced back toward the courtroom. I think she had something else, too. What's that? 40 years of experience watching her son. Outside, the December air felt sharp and cold. The sky remained gray. Yet somehow, everything looked different. The battle was finally over. The next challenge involved the money itself. $2 million hidden inside a suitcase wasn't just an asset. It was a responsibility. Patricia introduced me to Marcus Webb, a financial crimes attorney who specialized in handling unusual situations involving large sums of cash. Marcus explained everything carefully. The money had to be reported properly. Taxes would apply. Legal costs would reduce the amount further. When every obligation had been satisfied, the final number remained $1.4 million. I remember sitting at my classroom desk during lunch when Marcus called. Half a sandwich sat in front of me. A stack of 32 book reports waited to be graded. Marcus calmly informed me that my final net amount would be approximately $1.4 million. I thanked him. He thanked me. Then we hung up, and I finished my sandwich. Because honestly, what else was there to do? The process took nearly 2 months. Every dollar was documented, every form completed correctly, every legal requirement satisfied. By February, the money had been transferred into a new account established under the guidance of both attorneys. As for Richard Ellison, losing the estate claim turned out to be only the beginning of his problems. The documents introduced during the hearing attracted attention, particularly Dorothy's records and financial evidence. Eventually, the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office reopened its previous investigation. Officially, Patricia had nothing to do with it. The case simply resurfaced after new information entered the public record. At least, that was the official explanation. One afternoon in February, I drove to Gahanna and found Dorothy's house. A modest brick home on a quiet street. A covered porch, a small garden waiting for spring. I sat outside for several minutes. I wasn't sure what I expected to feel. What I felt instead was gratitude, not one-sided gratitude. something shared, as though a circle had quietly closed. Eventually, I drove away. Later that month, I received a letter from Dale Hargrove, the auction manager. He had apparently heard how everything turned out. The note was brief, professional, but the final sentence stayed with me. "I'm glad the right person opened that suitcase." I kept the letter. It now sits in the same folder as Dorothy's note. People often ask what I did with the money. The answer is simple. I handled it practically, the way Dorothy probably would have. I paid off my mortgage. I established college funds for Renata's 2 children. I anonymously funded an arts grant at my school so students could have access to better materials. The remainder was invested carefully with professional guidance. Then I went back to work. One Monday morning, I stood before my students and asked them to open their sketchbooks. A student named Maya, who had struggled all semester, showed me a drawing, a bird inside a cage, the door hanging open. "I wasn't going to show anyone," she admitted, "but it felt important." "Things that feel important usually are," I told her, and I meant every word. Spring arrived early that year. I built raised garden beds behind my house and planted tomatoes, herbs, and zinnias. For the first time in months, I spent a Saturday without calculating risks or anticipating problems. Life slowly settled into something familiar again. Still mine, just lighter. Paying off the mortgage changed more than I expected. It was like living beside a constant noise for years and only realizing it existed after it disappeared. That summer, I visited the Oregon coast. I read novels, walked gray beaches, ate clam chowder, did absolutely nothing urgent. Renata and I finally sorted through our mother's old photographs, a task we had avoided for nearly a decade. We laughed, we cried, we planned future trips. The experience had clarified something important. People mattered more than possessions. Family mattered more than money. That spring, my students produced some of the best artwork I had ever seen. Maya even won a regional competition. Watching her accept the award, I recognized the stunned expression on her face, the expression of someone still catching up to their own good fortune. I understood exactly how she felt. In April, Patricia informed me that Richard had been formally charged with exploiting a vulnerable adult. Investigators discovered a pattern of withdrawals from Dorothy's accounts, amounts carefully kept below reporting thresholds. He had been taking money for years. Dorothy had known. She protected what she could. And when she could no longer protect it herself, she trusted a suitcase and a stranger. The criminal trial was scheduled for autumn. By summer, Richard had already cycled through 3 attorneys. Swick and Bauer withdrew completely. In June, Diane moved out. I occasionally thought about her, about the way she repeatedly tried to restrain him, about the fear hidden behind her composure. I hoped she found a better life. In August, I attended another estate sale. Just another Saturday morning, coffee in hand, comfortable shoes. I bought a road atlas for $12 and a botanical print for $8. No hidden fortune, no secret compartments, just ordinary treasures. When I returned home, biscuits sat in the window as always. The garden was thriving, the mortgage was gone, and life finally was peaceful. Some things really are exactly what they seem. After everything that had happened, that felt like the most extraordinary discovery of all.